Greetings, friends. Welcome to the Eldritch Grimoire. Today's episode, Chapter 5, explores the spiritual and psychological bases for the creation of Kylo Ren by Ben Solo. The next episode, Chapter 6, will explore the salient reasons for and ramifications of Kylo Ren's death amid Ben's resurrection in the Rise of Skywalker. As discussed in Chapter 3, the principal story and the narrative arcs of the main characters in the original and sequel trilogies are far less transcendental in scope than those in the prequels. They do not concern the Chosen One, nor, despite the misguided perceptions of certain characters, particularly in The Last Jedi, do they impact the cosmic balance of the Force. Thus, the sequel trilogy is best considered according to the pedagogical function of myth discussed in the preface, which is no less important than mythology's spiritual or transcendental function. Recall that any narrative fulfilling the pedagogical function of myth serves three main purposes: cosmological, sociological, and psychological. Hence, the specific aim of this chapter is to explore the psychological origins and function of Ben Solo's alter ego, or better, his alter id, named Kylo Ren. Born in 5 ABY, a year and 5 days after the death of Vader and apparent death of Palpatine amid the rebellion's victory at the Battle of Endor, Ben Solo's strength in the Force was apparent to Leia even in utero. A somewhat colicky infant, Ben typically relaxed only when held by his parents or Chewbacca. During and after Ben's infancy, both Leia and Han became progressively consumed by their respective drive and wanderlust, largely abandoning young Ben to the care of a droid. They also refrained from disclosing his relation to Darth Vader to him, even as Ben began to lash out with the Force to express his frustrations. This hesitance created yet another barrier between themselves and Ben, exacerbating his burgeoning loneliness and introversion. Rather than addressing the deep-seated psychological sources of Ben's rage, their parenting foremost among them, Leia and Han attributed his moodiness to his ostensibly genetic propensity for fury and his apparently inherent introversion, i.e., his ostensibly natural inclination to the dark side. In this context of deficient parenting, Ben also heard voices that could not be explained, but offered him comfort and guidance while feeding his fears and insecurities regarding his family and himself. The source of these myriad voices was the spirit of Palpatine, reincarnated in a deficient clone body on Exegol, typically manifesting as the voice of his flesh puppet, Snoke. As Snoke/Palpatine's influence became increasingly apparent, again, instead of confronting these largely psychological, rather than force-driven, issues directly, amid Han's continual absence, Leia gradually distanced herself from Ben further, finally encouraging him to join Luke's nascent Jedi Academy prior to his 10th birthday in 15 ABY. Still ignorant of his grandfather Anakin's second life as Darth Vader, pre-adolescent Ben struggled under the weight of the legacy of the Chosen One and that of his uncle, Luke, the Last Jedi. At some point, young Ben fantasized about changing his name to one that he had invented, Kylo, a name combining parts of Skywalker and Solo, an expression representing his discomfort with, and yearning to free himself from, the weight and influence of these names. In any case, repeating the old Jedi Order and Obi-Wan's mistakes during Anakin's education, Luke consistently emphasized restraint with regard to Ben's use of the Force to prevent him from wielding it emotionally or for his own ends. Meanwhile, still shielding Ben from the truth of Vader's identity, Luke took on more students in 16 ABY, reigniting Ben's feelings of loneliness and abandonment, and thus his rage, flames that were constantly stoked by the voice of Snoke/Palpatine. No matter their actual feelings toward him, his various relationships with them, or his own superior Force abilities, Ben also assumed that his fellow Padawans believed the source of his place among them was nepotism, intensifying his self-perceived role as outcast and outsider. At this point, it should be clear that both young Ben Solo and his family could have benefited from psychoanalysis and therapy. Though rightfully and continually questioned, Freud's famous Oedipus complex, particularly its primordial urges and fears, the elementary ideas that drive it, must be resolved in early childhood to prevent associated neuroses later in life. Accordingly, as this episode illustrates, Kylo Ren is essentially the embodiment of young Ben Solo's unresolved Oedipus complex, an internal, psychological conflict that he will not resolve until Episode 9 via the literal and figurative death of Kylo Ren through the actions of Rey and Ben's vision of Han Solo's ghost. The basic structure of Freud's traditional Oedipus complex is a son's perceived sexual competition over his mother with his father. In short, the child desires connection, overtly sexual according to Freud, with his mother and the death of his father, i.e., his rival for her attentions, even, or particularly, at his own hands. These are initial expressions of the nascent id, which together with the ego and superego comprises the human psyche according to Freud's classic psychoanalytic theory. That is, Freud suggests that the interactions of the id, ego, and superego inform all consciousness and action. An instructional video from the 1960s, Freud, The Hidden Nature of Man, visualizes this as follows.
This is what I've discovered. There is the self we think we are, the self that attempts to deal with the outside world of reality. This self I call the ego. But ego is never the master of self, for we are constantly bedeviled by powerful unconscious forces in our beings. Before ego developed in us, there was id. Id. Id is all that is primitive and infantile within us. Id is the blind instincts of sexual desire and aggression. Id is opposed by another force that I call superego. Superego is rigid, punishing, and repressive, an inheritance from the repression of our parents and the restrictions that are part of the society we grow up in. So I found there are three distinct elements in our personalities. Ego, who deals with the world of reality, but who is also constantly affected by the demands of id and superego.
Honor thy father, or you will be punished.
You stole Mummy away from me. I'm taking your mother away on a holiday, David. I hate him. I'll kill him.
David's hate for Mr. Cooper is based on unconscious hate of his own father, caused by childhood jealousy, by the Oedipus complex. Freud said that without insight into these dark forces, we are doomed to play out our lives in an endless dramatization of our childhood relations with our parents.
The resolution of the Oedipus complex therefore develops the psychological tools that all children must possess to address their id-driven urges over time via the healthy interaction of their id, ego, and superego. This development occurs in a twofold process. First, via repression, the socially unacceptable actions and ideas driven by the id are blocked by the ego, the conscious mind, for fear of their consequences. However, repression does not resolve this fundamental id-ego conflict. It merely confines a child's id-driven impulses to his or her unconscious, where they continue to pressure the ego if they remain active. Hence, second, identification allows the child to adapt, that is, to incorporate into his or her superego personality characteristics of a same-sex parent. In the case of the Oedipal boy, this identification with his father resolves the id-ego conflict manifested in the Oedipus complex, overcoming and eliminating it through the development of his superego. By self-identifying with his father, this child internalizes his father's superego, his social morality, rendering the child a person who values and voluntarily follows social norms and rules, rather than simply complying with them out of fear of punishment or reprisal. In contrast, as in Ben Solo, when the Oedipal complex goes unresolved, the child will fail to develop a functional superego. This leaves his id and ego in an endless conflict whose origin is his unresolved, infantile, and primal urge to possess his mother and kill his father. This fundamental id-ego conflict will drive him to be, at best, an overly aggressive adult driven by overambition and vainglory. As Jordan Peterson explains,
ego is something like that too, because the id is this place of compulsion and drive, and the ego has to basically suppress that in the service of the superego. There's no idea of integration really in Freud. Now, I don't want to be rough on Freud, and I think part of the reason that he thought that way is because the patients he had were precisely those who weren't very well integrated because of their pathological past, and so they didn't know how to get those subsystems up into the overarching game, and so their only alternative was something like suppression or repression. Because if you don't know how to be aggressive in a sophisticated way, you're still going to be aggressive, but you're going to have to inhibit it, control yourself, because you can't just be aggressive around people. It just won't go well for you. So even if you can't do it in a sophisticated way, you're going to repress it, or you're going to get in trouble. Those are the options.
Due to the real and imagined neglect of his parents amid the influence of Palpatine, it is, then, Ben Solo's lack of a healthy superego and the chaotic rage that results that drive the fundamental conflict between his ego and id. Initially, this primal conflict drives infant Ben Solo to unconsciously lash out with the Force. Ultimately, it impels post-adolescent Ben to become Kylo Ren. In other words, during his childhood, Ben Solo's id-ego conflict results in his inability to feel compassion towards and build attachments with other people, ironically impelling the rage he feels at the lack of both compassion and attachment over time. This entails that Ben can never be a true Jedi or true Sith. Both orders instill a superego that resolves the id-ego conflict in inverse ways. For the Jedi, compassion is the basis of their selflessness and virtue in their pursuit of harmony in the Force. For the Sith, attachments, and the ultimate elimination thereof, structure their cold, rational pursuit of ultimate power and dark side triumph. Returning to our narrative, based on Charles Soule's limited Rise of Kylo Ren comic book series, in 19 ABY, Ben accompanied his uncle Luke to a forgotten Jedi outpost with Lor San Tekka. There, Master and apprentice were confronted by an armored group led by a masked pirate calling himself Ren. Although Luke easily defeated these Knights of Ren, while criticizing their lack of finesse and technique in wielding the dark side, their leader sensed the darkness in 14-year-old Ben, tempting him with the freedom offered by giving into his shadow. This shadow, according to Jung, functions similarly to Freud's id, but it fundamentally differs in its origins. That is,
in Freud's mind, in Freud's model of the mind, the id was completely personal. It was completely, your own, and it was something that you produced as a person when you repressed those desires as a baby or as a child. You had traumas that you repressed, or you had desires that you repressed, or you had motives that you repressed. It was completely your own. Jung believed that the shadow was not just your own. It was also an archetype. So it was something that you inherited from your ancestors. It was something, a prototype of the darkness of the human. Let me give you an example. We as human beings, we have an aggressive side. We have a violent side. Now, what Jung believed was that all that violence and all that aggression in the shadow was not just yours. It was something that you inherited as well as a human being. It was a part of you that you got in your inheritance through your genes or through your neuronal networks that are ancient. So what Jung believed was that there are parts of the primitive brain that are not actually just born, or they are not, that part of your psyche is not born with you. It's something that you inherit. And you could inherit that through biology, for example, because your mother and your mother's mother and everybody's cells and everybody's neural networks are kind of in you, because you're born through that process of inheritance. So that he believed that the shadow was not just, it was partly you, partly your own negativity, but also negativity that was inherited. Whereas in the id, Freud said everything was you, all that.
Here, then, in this mythogenetic zone we call Star Wars, Teenage Ben Solo's unresolved id-ego conflict gradually moves him towards his shadow, towards the dark side. In this initial encounter with the Knights of Ren, he thus observed them as personifications of the triumph of the id over the ego, without any restrictions imposed by the superego. Largely untrained amateurs with limited force abilities, the Knights of Ren were more akin to the Lost Boys in Peter Pan than to trained warriors with an ethos, lacking any real goals beyond the fulfillment of their adolescent and toxic desires amid the absence or possibility of reprisal. Ren, their leader, therefore understood the dark side only from this limited and flawed perspective, perceiving it to be the id made manifest, the nihilistic shadow of chaos that exists only for the sake of chaos, destruction without creation. Nearly a decade later, in 28 ABY, Ben was 23 years old, the same age as Anakin Skywalker in Episode 3. In this year, Leia's political enemies in the New Republic Senate made Darth Vader's true identity, and thus her and her family's heritage, public knowledge. For Ben, this was yet another instance of betrayal and abandonment by Leia and Luke, as he learned this news not through them, but via a public HoloNet report. Moreover, the added weight of Vader's legacy, specifically the myth of his unequaled power in the Force and elevated position in the Empire, exacerbated the conflict between Ben's ego and id to new heights, annihilating any bridges that he had hitherto attempted to build between the two. In this context, Snoke perceived the fruition of his now decades-long manipulation of Ben, the end goal of which, for Palpatine, was to fashion him into an apprentice, albeit as a tool, a hammer much more similar to Darth Maul than Darth Vader, to be discarded upon attaining his ultimate goal, reincarnation in the body of Rey. In this context, Ben's endless psychological conflict between his id and ego therefore became evident in the living Force as an internal struggle between light and dark. Critically, this was a result of his unbridled chaotic rage, rather than the passionate pursuit of strength and power typical of Dark Jedi and Sith. True to form, upon perceiving this inner conflict and rising darkness in Ben, rather than any member of his family speaking to him directly to at least acknowledge, or at best resolve, their issues concerning Vader's legacy, Luke simply approached the sleeping Ben in the middle of the night, igniting his lightsaber over his slumbering apprentice. This incredibly un-Jedi-like action was driven by Luke's visions of Ben's role in the death of everyone he loved and the destruction of everything he had built, visions that rapidly became real. Although Luke quickly deactivated his lightsaber, this final betrayal was too much for Ben's tortured ego to bear, enabling his id to briefly triumph and guide his actions in an explosion of rage and the dark side. Unconscious of his actions, Ben Solo therefore channeled the dark side for the first time, summoning a storm of Force lightning that destroyed Luke's Jedi Temple, killing everyone inside, except for 3 absent students. Without sufficient time to process his unconscious actions, while believing he had killed Luke, Ben was immediately confronted by these 3 students. Still far from being Kylo Ren, Ben's departure from the planet Tython and the remnants of Luke's temple was initially hindered by these 3 students. Nevertheless, after warning them of his true power, he easily defeated them, severely wounding one of these students in his rage, albeit somewhat accidentally. Afterward, Ben sought advice from Snoke in person. Convalescing from damage done to him by Luke in a still unknown incident, Snoke advised Ben to seek his true name in the company of the Knights of Ren, to become what Snoke called his truest self. Learning of Ben's childhood fantasy of being called Kylo, Snoke suggested it was because Ben had created this name as a child that it was pure and true, i.e., representative of Ben's deepest inclinations and the parts of himself he wanted to cut away. Subsequently, Ben sought out the Knights of Ren, only to be confronted by the 3 Jedi students once again. In this instance, Ben's inner turmoil between id and ego at once led him to attack them and rendered him incapable of killing them. Even so, one of them was killed indirectly by Ben while defending himself from a misguided attack. Shortly thereafter, Ben Solo became an initiate in the Knights of Ren, his full membership contingent on him murdering someone important to him. However, Ben, still guided by his ego and the tattered remnants of the deficient superego he had built as a Padawan, initially refrained from killing anyone during the Knights' marauding. Eventually, the remaining Jedi students confronted, for the last time, Ben and the Knights on the mid-rim moon of Mimban. One of these students, a Padawan named Tai, had been the closest thing to a friend Ben had had at the temple. Imploring Ben's ego in this encounter on Mimban, Tai reminded him of all the good he had done and could do, suggesting that these would ultimately outweigh both the immoral actions Ben had taken and overcome the rage he still felt. Here, then, for perhaps the first time in his life, someone for whom Ben cared showed him the path to shift his self-perception from the mere embodiment of a legacy, whether light or dark, towards a person capable of giving and deserving love. Deeply affected by this advice, Ben seemed prepared to turn from his path toward Kylo and the chaos of the Ren. Instead, however, the Marauder Ren broke Tai's neck with the Force, removing the last impediment to a fundamental shift in Ben Solo's id-ego conflict, that is, the final triumph of Ben Solo's id over his ego, as he watched his only friend die. Taunted by Ren for his inability to live in the shadow, the now id-driven Ben reacted by simply proclaiming himself to be the shadow. Amid the cheers of Palpatine and Snoke, the horror of Leia, and the first suggestion of Rey's connection to him in the Force, Ben Solo then easily killed Ren with Tai's lightsaber, simultaneously defeating the other Knights in an explosion of dark side energy. Deeming himself merely the murderer his family and peers always feared him to be, Ben then coldly killed Vo, the last remaining, utterly defenseless Jedi student, thereby solidifying his new position as the Master of the Knights of Ren. The final act of Ben Solo necessary for the birth of Kylo Ren was the bleeding of his Kyber crystal. In the Disney canon, Sith lightsabers have crimson blades because their crystals have been corrupted by the dark side. According to Darth Sidious in The Secrets of the Sith, first, Sith must seize a pure crystal from the lightsaber of a Jedi they have vanquished in combat, for the saber of a Sith is not given, it is taken. Then, they must infuse that crystal with their pain, anger, and hatred, bending it to their will. This corrupts the crystal, aligning it with the dark side and making it bleed with unbridled crimson power. The bleeding process can yield unpredictable results. Some crystals shatter, making their energies unstable and unpredictable. Notably, instead of acquiring that of another Jedi, Ben bled his own formerly pure Kyber crystal, reflecting both his ego's reticence towards harmful actions and Kylo's status as a blunt dark side hammer rather than a true Sith. This was also the single in-canon instance in which Ben/Kylo exhibited yellow eyes, i.e., the only time that he was purely driven only by the dark side, rather than being driven to the dark side via the chaotic rage of his id-ego conflict. In any case, reflecting his unresolved psyche, his shifting, unsettled position between light and dark, the result of the continuous conflict between his now dominant id and subservient ego amid the chaotic rage that drives this entire cycle, Ben's newly corrupted crystal cracked in two. This entails that the conflict within Ben that gave birth to Kylo could never be resolved as long as Kylo lived. Ben invented Kylo as a child driven by his Oedipus conflict and id-ego conflict to remove himself from the weight of a legacy he didn't want and parents whom he didn't think wanted him. Sustained by the Ren, the dark side wielded for the sake of adolescent nihilism rather than in the cold pursuit of power and victory, Kylo Ren therefore personified the past that Ben Solo had killed amid the rise of his shadow, his id, and the sublimation of his ego and Jedi legacy. Just as his id and ego were locked in an endless struggle that impelled Kylo forward, so was his lightsaber powered by two connected crystals that should have been, but could never be, one. That is, no lightsaber hilt could resolve the conflict between these crystals that were both two and one, just as no superego could resolve the conflict in Ben Solo's psyche, made manifest in Kylo Ren. As we will explore in the next chapter, this chaos prevented Kylo Ren from progressing beyond his rage because he personified Ben Solo's untamed id. That is, Kylo's raison d'etre was the same misguided fury that infant Ben Solo expressed amid the absence of his father and perceived lack of affection from his mother. Accordingly, Chapter 6 will show how the arc in the sequel trilogy that ultimately led to the death of Kylo and the rebirth of Ben involved the resolution of his Oedipal complex through his literal murder of his father in Episode 7 and final attainment of his mother's eternal love via the final act of Leia in Episode 9. All of this was facilitated by the influence of Rey, who personified the superego built on Jedi traditions that Ben was never able to develop due not to his natural inclination to the dark side, but to his psychological issues originating in his family's ignorance of their generational responsibility. Indeed, one of Star Wars' principal pedagogical functions, as myth, is to highlight the importance of generational responsibility, of overcoming the deficiencies of your predecessors to build a better future for your descendants. However, just as both individuals and institutions inevitably repeat the same cycles of the eternal return, the circles in the cosmic mandala, in different variations, so was the New Republic destroyed through its own ignorance and inaction amid the warnings of the Resistance, just as the Old Republic was destroyed by the Empire amid the warnings of the seeds of the Rebellion. Similarly, just as the Jedi Order and Obi-Wan Kenobi failed to prevent Anakin's fall amid the influence of Palpatine, so did Han, Leia, and Luke fail to prevent Ben's fall amid the influence of Snoke. Nevertheless, the characters Ben Solo and Anakin Skywalker are as different as Kylo Ren and Darth Vader. Born of virgins in the Force, infant and pre-adolescent Anakin perfectly balanced his ego, id, and superego, the latter of which he seemed to have been more or less born with. Moreover, Shmi loved Anakin, and Anakin alone, unconditionally during his first 9 years of life, preventing the development of any Oedipal issues while foreshadowing Anakin's equally beneficial and destructive perceptions of loyalty and love. Anakin's fall was, then, the result of a slow process and multiple failures of institutions and individuals, ultimately leading to his fated balancing of the Force, immolation, and rebirth as Darth Vader. In contrast, Ben Solo's ultimate fate was arguably unrelated to Kylo Ren. That is, Kylo was a function of Ben's destiny, a persona that his id chose to create based on unresolved damage to his psyche, altering the trajectory of his life, but not its end. Kylo Ren was, therefore, not a fall, but a choice. The choice to forever remain unbalanced, as Ben's ego continually struggled but consistently failed to regain control from his raging id. In addition, the dominance of his id ensured that Kylo was forever attracted to the dark side, even as Ben's ego inherently called to the light. Never a true Sith, Kylo Ren therefore simply wielded the dark side like an angry toddler, smashing his toys, lashing out whenever he did not get his way in any context beyond the violent paternal reprisals of his surrogate father, Snoke. Furthermore, because of the chaos of his id-ego conflict, Kylo was incapable of accepting Snoke's authority beyond the latter's ability to physically reprimand him. As personified id, Kylo Ren would never be influenced by the superego of another, let alone develop his own. Accordingly, as we will see in the following episode, it was only through his connection to Rey as a dyad in the Force that Ben Solo was finally able to kill Kylo Ren. That is, to finally resolve the id-ego conflict that had driven his entire life. In other words, the Force did not create Kylo Ren, Ben Solo did. Nor did the Force end Kylo Ren's existence. Ben Solo did. This concludes Chapter 5 of the Eldritch Grimoire. Good journey, my friends.